Welcome everyone to tonight's Reasons to Believe meeting. Tonight we have Don Wallar speaking about the resurrection of Jesus. So just to let you know, we are looking for a place to have in-person meetings, and hopefully we'll have some news for you soon. So in the meantime, we're going to keep on meeting online, and I'll pass it over to you, Don, to start your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bruno, and welcome everyone to tonight's talk. Some of you may have heard this talk before, and if so, that's great. Thanks for coming back. I have actually added some new material to this talk, so hopefully there'll be some new things that perhaps you've not heard before. But this is a topic that I certainly love to speak on because it's such a important historical event and foundational to the Christian worldview, as we'll see hopefully a little bit more tonight. So without further ado, perhaps before I go to the next slide, which is all about speaking about a topic that is difficult for most people, and that is the topic of death. I had no idea that circumstances would be such that they are this evening for me personally. My one son's wife's father is in fact on his last breaths as we speak tonight. He is happy and peace, but it's a difficult time for the family. So here I am speaking on resurrection, whilst a extended family member is in fact passing through that important event. So it's a very personal thing tonight for me. So let's talk about death. And the very first thing that we know about death when we think about it as individuals is, I will die. This is an unescapable fact. However, if you approach the topic of death from a, let's call it a complete naturalist perspective, that is that there is no, there is no meaning, there is no purpose, there is no, and there's nothing outside of our existence in the natural realm, then you face some very stark realities. The first is that you will die. The second is that you will die soon, relatively speaking. And you will die alone, and you will remain dead forever. This is uncomfortable, but it's the truth, and it is inescapable. And it's why so many people fear death, because it is inevitable. One of those things that the jokes, I'm sure you've heard, that there's two certainties in life, death and taxes. We've all heard that joke, but we forget how real the former actually is. Taxes actually can be avoided if you're very clever and you have lots of money, but death cannot be avoided. No one has ever cheated it or escaped it. The second reason that people fear it is because it's mysterious. We just don't understand what happens. We don't know what's on the other side, or even if there is another side. What is the experience itself like? It's a very intense, personal experience. And it's something that each individual has to face alone. Yes, you can have people around you, of course. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that your death is something that you must face alone. Death separates us from our loved ones. This is another grim reality, but it is the truth. And why people fear death, because they don't want to be separated from that which is important to them and that which they have known their whole life. Death puts an end to our hopes and dreams. Everybody has those hopes and dreams, things they want to accomplish. in their life, and most people don't get to accomplish all their hopes and dreams. And so death puts an end to that attempt, that goal, that desire. It's over for the individual. And people fear death because it ends in oblivion. They see it as the end of all things, and there is nothing to follow. Someone once said that the death rate of human beings is 1 per person, and that's absolutely true. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. But actually, it's actually worse than that. And I want to talk about why that is. According to the Naturalist Worldview, which I mentioned earlier very briefly, but I'll just reiterate, that matter and energy is all there is. The natural realm that we can see and feel and touch is all that exists. The cosmos that we can see, the universe, is all there is. If that is true, then this notion of death is actually much worse, because not only does the individual die, but humanity collectively goes extinct eventually. This is according to the laws of physics that cosmologists, astrophysicists, astronomers can tell us in no uncertain terms is going to be the end. All life on Earth will go extinct. The Earth, our solar system, the Milky Way galaxy will literally come apart, and our sun, indeed all stars, will burn out, burn up all of their fuel and become dead hulks. And indeed, the entire cosmos will end cold, dark, and lifeless. All right, are you completely depressed? If you're not, then that means you must have some hope somewhere. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. But I wanted to stress this because this is actually the logical understanding of a naturalist worldview. It's inescapable. This is the end of the universe as we understand it. But what if not all dead men stay dead? That would be a very interesting thing to examine, would it not? And of course, we know from the scriptures and from history, and that's what tonight is all about, that there was a man who walked the earth and who died and rose again. And Paul speaks about this in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 14. And he gets right to the point. And he says, if Christ has not been raised, excuse me, then our preaching is useless. And so is your faith, which was a very bold statement for Paul to make. What he's saying is that our entire faith system, our worldview, is dependent on this fact. And if it did not happen, he goes on to say that our faith is to be pitied. We, as a group of people who believe in this, are to be pitied. And that's a very strong thing, especially coming from the Apostle Paul. So let's talk about the resurrection and the evidence that we have for it. And here I'm going to go through a number of things in a sequence, in order. And if you have questions at any point, maybe just jot them down and we'll try and cover those off at the end. The first evidence that we have, now this is evidence that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Keep in mind that Christians talk about Jesus spending 3 days dead. He rose on the 3rd day. It wasn't 3 full 24-hour periods. The Jewish method of counting days is any part of a day counted as day 1. So on Friday, Jesus was crucified. And Saturday, he was dead. And Sunday, he rose from the dead on the third day. So I get this question. I thought I'd just deal with it right out of the gate. How come this confusion? If he died on a Friday, that's not 3 days to Sunday. But yes, it is in the Jewish understanding. So the first evidence we have is the empty tomb, but it wasn't actually empty. A lot of people say the empty tomb, but in fact, there was a very important article left in the tomb, and that is the grave clothes that Jesus was wrapped in. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because those that were involved in wrapping his body after he died would recognize those clothes or not as being those that Jesus was wrapped in, especially given that they would also remember which tomb he was placed in. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of one of the objections. So there was a set of grave clothes there, but no body. So either somebody removed the wrappings or the wrappings were discarded and the body moved itself. The second, and probably one of the most powerful evidences for Jesus' resurrection, is the fact that he appeared to people, real people. And we're going to go through each of these, by the way, in a lot more detail. So I'm just introducing each one to you, and then we'll go back and we'll go through in more detail. Not only did Jesus appear to people, but his body bore the marks. Which marks? The marks of having been crucified. So again, there was specific evidence that anyone who was familiar with crucifixion and who had been there at the crucifixion would recognize as being legitimate and exactly what they'd expect to see. The fourth thing is the time between the events of the crucifixion and the resurrection and the eyewitness claims. What do I mean by that? Well, if Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, and then people made these claims hundreds of years later, you'd be forgiven for going, well, I don't know. But the fact that the eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Jesus made those claims almost immediately after he rose from the dead lends a lot of credence to their story and to their arguments that they saw him. We'll come back to this. The fifth evidence is the extraordinary transformation of Jesus' disciples. These men and women who followed Jesus were dramatically different after his resurrection. And we need to explain this because it's an important aspect of the evidence. Probably the greatest conversion in all of history was Saul of Tarsus. And Saul himself makes the claim that Jesus' resurrection is what changed him. And keep in mind who Saul of Tarsus was before he met the resurrected Messiah. A man who was imprisoning Christians, torturing Christians, looking wherever he could find them, putting them in prison, and generally attacking the Christian church and completely opposed to the Christians and their worldview. The emergence of the historic Christian church in the face of tremendous persecution. This is a fact. And we need to ask ourselves, why would that be? Why would the Christian church emerge in a culture where they were attacked, vilified, persecuted? How do we explain that? And lastly, we see a big shift in terms of the worship practices of Jewish believers at that time. So like I said, we're going to look at these now in turn. Some of them we'll look at together, but I'm going to deal with each one in kind. So the first one is the empty tomb. We know that the burial accounts originated very early on. There were accounts circulating of Jesus' burial and his resurrection long before the New Testament books were ever written. There was both verbal communication of this, obviously, but there were written earlier accounts. And secondly, and more importantly, the accounts of Jesus' burial came from multiple independent sources. It's not like one guy came up with this idea. There were lots of these accounts that emerged independently. Historians, and by historians, I don't mean Christian historians, I mean secular historians who have looked at these evidences for the empty tomb, have no good reason to doubt the existence of any of the key people that are mentioned in the burial scenario. No scholarly historian has ever challenged the record that we read in the Bible when it comes to the facts of what occurred during the crucifixion, burial, and burial of Jesus. The people involved, where it was, how it occurred, etc. It's essentially accepted. And fourthly, this is interesting. The gospel accounts indicate that it was women who were the actual witnesses of the events initially. A great deal of focus is placed on the fact that there were women involved. Now, in our day and age, we just take that for granted that, of course, you know, if a woman said this, that you'd record it as such. But keep in mind the history of that period. Women were not afforded the level of authority that men had, sadly. And it was very much a part of the culture. And so for someone to write or record or have an account from a woman and that be written down ultimately in the New Testament was very highly unusual. And so this lends more credibility to the eyewitness accounts than actually if only men had made those claims, because women would not have been considered credible witnesses, and yet they are considered credible witnesses by the New Testament writers. This is a huge surprise. Okay, Jesus' resurrection appearances. So the New Testament specifically mentions 12 different resurrection appearances. 12 different ones. This was not the same resurrection appearance recorded and related 12 different times. 12 different specific resurrection appearances. His body bore the marks. It could be seen and touched, that is his body. Jesus even ate and drank after his resurrection. All of this was recorded. So that's interesting. He appeared to men and to women. He appeared to friends and to enemies, to individuals, to small groups, and to larger groups. He appeared indoors and outdoors, and he appeared mornings and evenings. I'd not seen this before, but it's true. Those are all different scenarios. And so you'd have to be very deliberate if you were falsifying the information. You'd have to come up with a scenario for each one of those instead of just saying, yeah, well, you know, it was 2 PM and this is what happened and that's all you ever knew. We see a variety of appearances. He appeared to some people once and to other people multiple times, which is interesting. All right, let's talk about the time between the events of the crucifixion, burial, resurrection, and the claims. So the Apostle Paul claims that he saw the risen Messiah. The Apostle Paul, of course, was alive and well at the time that the events of the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection took place. He was not a disciple of Jesus at that time, quite the opposite, as we talked about earlier, but he was alive. And not long after that, he claims to have encountered the risen Messiah. Paul further claims that prior to this experience of seeing the risen Messiah, that is Jesus, he had received firsthand testimony from others who were eyewitnesses. Paul writes about this. So Paul had heard from credible eyewitnesses that this was the case, and then he had his own experience, right? So the eyewitness accounts that he received before he followed Christ and after he followed Christ, but in the interim, he had his own experience. Now let's look at those earlier eyewitnesses, because they're kind of interesting in and of their own right. Those eyewitnesses included Peter, excuse me, the 12 disciples, more than 500 brothers and sisters, it says, James, all the apostles, including Matthias, who you may recall was the disciple that replaced Judas after Judas went and killed himself. Most people forget about Matthias. Nobody ever mentions him. Poor guy. Now, here's the thing that I want you to get. This is all very well, but so what? Well, the so what is this. There was not enough time for a myth to arise in regards to the events around Jesus' resurrection. We all know what a myth is, right? And there just wasn't enough time. All the myths that you read about, you know, Greek mythology and all of these other types of mythology that you can read are all related to things that happened long before they were written down as myths. And there's a lot of hallmarks and characteristics of myths versus a classical eyewitness account, and it's easy to tell the difference. But the key I wanted you to get here is that there was not enough time. There's no way that a myth could have emerged. Oh yes, did you hear about this Jesus who long ago rose from the dead? No, man, there were people alive. You could go and talk to them. So even if somebody tried to create a myth, it would have been debunked and said, it's not a myth, it's true, it really happened, I was there, you know? Okay, let's talk about the transformations of people. So now, picture this. Jesus has spent 3 years walking as a rabbi amongst the people, lots of followers, men, women, and children followed him. And near the end, he warned them that he was going to be crucified and that he would rise again, but they would all be dispersed. And so what happens? Jesus dies. And of course, they're all hiding because the authorities who crucified him are going to be coming after them next, because guess what? They were the followers of this Jesus, this, you know, self-proclaimed Messiah who actually had delusions of grandeur and thought he was God. He's dead and you're next. We're coming after you. So we can forgive the disciples for being a little bit timid and being in hiding. And they were. They were very timid. They were not out there preaching anything because they were afraid of the authorities. Sorry, I seem to be developing a cough here. All the apostles, okay, so it wasn't just some of the sort of hangers-on, it was the core. All of these people became courageous preachers of the gospel, but not only were they courageous preachers after the resurrection event, but they did so in the face of intense Jewish and Roman persecution. So it's not like the persecution went away and the Romans all went, oh, okay, well, Jesus rose, so it's all good. I guess he was who he says he was. No, that's not what happened. They were still persecuted as a people, and they wanted to put an end to this so-called Jewish sect, these so-called Christians. And what we observe historically is that these people were transformed from being timid and afraid to being courageous to the point of death. How do you explain that? Doubting Thomas became believing Thomas. Why? What happened? You can read about it in the Bible. He had an encounter with the risen Christ, a very personal one, where Jesus said to him, okay, Thomas, come over here. All right, put your finger in my hands. See that? See that hole there? Yeah, that's where they put the nail through. Through my wrist. And Thomas goes, wow. He falls on the ground. He begins to worship the Lord. And of course, Jesus doesn't condemn him. He just says, you know, faith means you have to put your trust in me, not just always look for perfect evidence, because the other apostles had believed in the absence of that particular evidence. Well, that's okay. I've got a lot of time for Thomas. James, who was the brother of Jesus, he was a bit of a skeptic. You can read about it. He was going, well, you know, he was with the rest of the family going, gee, you know, who does Jesus think he is? You know, he's just like us, like, you know, he's a carpenter and, you know, he's out there and, you know, maybe we should go and get him and tell him to stop this preaching nonsense. And yeah, he was a skeptic, his own brother. And James goes on to become the leader of the Jerusalem church, one of the key leaders of the early church, and helped to form many of the customs and approaches that the very, very early church adopted in dealing with the fact that they were Jewish, but now believing in a risen Messiah. And of course, we mentioned this earlier, the greatest conversion in history, that is Saul, who became Paul. And I mentioned earlier how, you know, we know the story of Saul. He was not, you know, a take them or leave them kind of guy when it came to the Christian followers. He hated them, and he had the authority to literally go into people's homes, arrest them, bind them, and take them off to prison for their faith. And this is the guy who goes on to write 2/3 of the New Testament. How do we explain this? And lastly, the church arises in the face of persecution. This is something that it's easy to gloss over and forget that why would so many people be willing to align themselves with this so-called new religion, this new Jewish sect, who followed the risen Messiah, if it was all a hoax? And why would they do so knowing that it could mean certain death? Maybe not of themselves, but of their family, of their friends, and still they did it. This is very, very difficult to explain if there wasn't something absolutely amazing that had occurred and to which they were willing to give their lives. Sunday becomes the new day of worship. You may not be aware of this, but if you know anyone who's Jewish, you know that the Sabbath day has always been celebrated from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. And it has been that way forever, as long as history goes back for the Jewish people. This is what the Sabbath has meant. And it was so important to God that it was one of the 10 commandments, as we know. And Jewish people have celebrated the Sabbath through all of their history, even in the face of wars and persecution and pogroms, and you name it, they have kept the Sabbath. And there's an old saying that says that more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. And it's a foundational part of their life to this day. But something happened to change all that for those early Jewish believers. Most of which, as I say, those early believers were in fact Jewish. So they would have totally understood Sabbath, yep, Friday night till Saturday, sundown to sundown. There is no theological or ceremonial reason for Jews to suddenly start regarding Sunday as a special day rather than Saturday. There just wasn't in their history. And something changed all of that, because all of a sudden these Jewish believers were saying, no, we're going to celebrate Sunday because that's the day that our Jewish Messiah rose from the dead. And so there was a shift historically that occurred very early on and remains to this day. Have you ever wondered why Christians celebrate Sundays and Jewish people celebrate Saturdays? Have you ever wondered? Well, that's the reason. And I don't think there's any particular, strong argument why you have to celebrate the Sabbath on a Sunday or on a Saturday. But the fact is, there was a shift for these early Jewish believers, and we have to explain why that would happen, because that is not something that would just happen willy-nilly. Okay. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and we're going to, so that's the sort of body of evidence for the resurrection. And I think some of those are more powerful arguments than others. But one of the things that I discovered in doing some more research for this talk tonight was how many secular historians actually accept this evidence at face value. They don't dispute the evidence. They dispute the conclusion, i.e., therefore Jesus is God, i.e., therefore I should follow him and give him my life. They dispute that, but that's a different matter. They don't dispute a lot of the details of the evidence that you heard tonight, which is remarkable. There are, of course, other extra-biblical records that talk about Jesus' existence and what he did and how he stirred up a lot of trouble, and the authorities dealt with him. Guys like Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, these Roman historians, they wrote about Jesus, but they didn't detail the resurrection. They didn't write a lot of detail around it. Okay, so I'm going to move now to talk a little bit about objections and what are some of the things that people have said. In spite of all this, they still say, yeah, but. Yeah, but what about this? Okay, fine. So we're gonna deal with each one of those in turn. So the first one is called the legend theory, and that is that Jesus was just a legend or a myth. And we've already kind of touched on this tonight. And just by way of reminder, the reports of Jesus' resurrection are traced to these creedal statements that predated the New Testament books, like I said, and some of them go back to the eyewitness period. These were documents that were circulating early on that spoke about Jesus before the New Testament was compiled and long before it became canonical or part of the church canon, which came much, much later. But the key point that I made earlier, and I just want to reinforce again here, is that there was not enough time for a myth to arise. And it's interesting because the apostles themselves openly acknowledged the difference between a myth and facts. They strongly asserted that they were eyewitnesses. So Peter, for example, in 2 Peter 1, verses 16 to 18, he says this. He said, "We did not follow cleverly devised tales, but we were eyewitnesses." That's Peter talking. Now, he should know. He was there, right? The second thing I would say is that just because some people raise the fact that there are a lot of myths out there where it seems that the myth contains a lot of similarities to Jesus' life, but this is a false argument, because just because someone's life contains similarities to a myth does not make his life a myth. It's just a coincidence that those myths have the same aspects as Jesus' life did, as recorded in the scriptures. And there's a stronger argument that could be made that Jesus' life in the scriptures was used and borrowed to create the myth. So I'm talking about some of the myths around Osiris and other things, books made famous like the Da Vinci Code and so on. Fourth point here is that the biblical writings, our biblical writings that we have, are not mythological in style. What do I mean by that? When you read the scriptures, any person with any understanding of what mythological writing looks like would not conclude that the scriptures are mythological. For example, if you were reading a creation story and you opened the book of Genesis, chapter 1, and it said that in that day, the great dragon belched forth from his belly the cosmos and the earth, you would recognize that as mythological. But when we read the scriptures, it's not that kind of language at all. And some books, like Acts, for example, I mentioned here, is almost forensic in style. What do I mean by that? It's almost like a criminal investigator would document a crime scene. And Luke makes no bones about this. When he wrote the book of Luke and he wrote Acts, he actually starts out the book by saying to a Roman official, Theophilus, he says, "I investigated everything from the beginning." Now, keep in mind, Luke was not an eyewitness to the resurrection. He was later. But he investigated everything, he says, from the beginning, and he wanted this friend of his to know all about what he had heard and been taught. And so we have the book of Acts, which is incredibly detailed. You know, there's details about shipwrecks, and I went here and they went there and they did that and he said that and they said that and they spent this time in that prison in that town. You can go and look it up. Yep, that all makes sense. Yep, you can trace their route the way they went. It's exactly in the order that Luke wrote it. This is a forensic document. When it comes, just coming back to this thing about myths, one of the things that one of the tools that a lot of these people use when they make claims that Jesus' life was a myth, and they're all just myths and Jesus is just another one, they use what I call nugget logic, and that is that all you have to do is find a nugget of similarity between an Egyptian myth, say, and Jesus, his life, and then you can claim an entire gold mine of falsehood. You can claim that all of Jesus' life is a myth because you find this one little similarity. Well, that's nugget logic, and it's not valid. You can't do that from a logical argument perspective. Okay, let's carry on. The second one is what's known as the fraud theory, and this is probably one of the more popular ones. And the fraud theory basically is that someone stole the body. Okay, someone stole the body. Well, it's interesting because the Bible actually mentions this idea before anybody else thought it up. Which, to me, when I read that, I remember thinking, well, gee, why would you go there? Because you're, opening up the very argument that people are going to use. Well, it's because they wanted to address it right out of the gate. So in Matthew 28, 11 to 15, the Bible talks about the notion that the authorities were accusing the disciples of stealing the body in order to continue to promulgate their lies about him being resurrected. And they went about, making sure that, or trying to make sure that they could kill this idea before it got any more credence or any further wider acceptance. And so the problem with this is that the religious leaders at that time, they say that they paid the soldiers to say that the disciples stole the body. This is what the Bible records. Well, if the disciples stole the body, then what do you do? If the authorities stole it, then when the disciples claim he's alive, you just do what? You produce the body, right? If the disciples stole it, there's absolutely nothing for them to gain and everything to lose if that's true. So it just didn't make any sense. This argument makes no sense that anybody would steal the body, because if somebody stole the body and you want to put an end to this big lie that Jesus rose from the dead, that he's not dead anymore, all you got to do is what? Produce the body. There it is, guys. Sorry. And that's the end of everything, right? Well, it's funny. Nobody ever could produce the body. And there are a lot of critics of the resurrection out there, but even the most ardent ones don't buy this argument for the reasons that I just laid out, because it's so easy to see how it could be refuted. Okay, let's talk about the third one. This is known as the wrong tomb theory. They went to the wrong tomb. So the disciples were so confused, they were so distraught that they went to the wrong place after Jesus was laid in the tomb. So we need to ask this question. Could the women who were the first there, remember, in their grief, could they have gone to the wrong tomb? Well, it's not a completely unreasonable idea. It is possible, but here's the problem with that. Let's assume it's true. Let's assume they went to the wrong tomb. There are lots of people around that would have corrected their error. Said, no, Mary, no, that's not where it was. It was over there. Oh, okay, sorry. And then they would have gone to the right tomb. So it's not really a strong argument. Secondly, what about the soldiers that were placed on guard? The authorities, remember, were very afraid that the disciples were going to come and steal away the body. So they placed these guards in front of the tomb specifically to guard it. So did they guard the wrong one too? Not likely. And even if they did, all the authorities had to do was produce the body. There it is, guys. Sorry. Go away with your silly little religion. Okay. Now, the next one is a sort of a twist on the wrong tomb theory, and that is the relocation theory. Jesus' body was moved. And this is interesting because there was a reburial practice that was common in ancient Israel, but it did not have anything to do with relocating bodies. It had to do with relocating the bones of a dead person long after they had died, and all that was left was a pile of bones. And they used a clay box known as an ossuary in order to do this. There's just no evidence for this, that the body was relocated. The Bible gives significant detail about the tomb itself. It talks about Joseph of Arimathea, the fact that he was a wealthy secret follower of Jesus, that it was a new tomb, that the tomb was located in a garden. These are details. These are not just, yeah, there was a tomb, Jesus was put there and then he wrote. No, there's specific details that the scripture gives us, and those documents, that is, those biblical documents, are trustworthy. Given the level of detail that the writer gives us about this tomb, would the same writer leave out an important detail that his body was moved? Probably not. In other words, if he's going to go to all the trouble of saying whose tomb it was, that it was new, it was in a garden and everything else, don't you think he would have mentioned that actually the body was moved after a couple of days? And even if that was the case, then again, just show us the body, right? So the body becomes really important if you want to undermine the claims that the eyewitnesses made. Just for your interest, this is a picture of a real ossuary. And there's a little story, that little side, if you'll permit me to tell you about this. Most of you may remember the story of the man who came up to Jesus and said, I'll follow you, Jesus, but just permit me to go and bury my father. And Jesus says, what? He says, let the dead bury the dead, let the dead bury the dead, you come and follow me. And if you read that, and you're any kind of a thinking, feeling human being, you would, be forgiven for being taken aback by that statement, and wonder, well, why would Jesus be so harsh and so unfeeling and cruel with someone whose father just died, and he's got to go and, he just wants to go and, be with the family. Well, the fact is that this practice of putting the bones of a deceased person in an ossuary typically took place a year or more after the person had died. And it was a fairly common practice, particularly for those who had a little bit of money, more than poor. And so they would get one of these boxes, these ossuaries, and they would place the bones of the person where they were buried into the ossuary, and then the ossuary would go into a commemorative spot to honor the person. And scholars tell us that this is the case for this young man who was speaking to Jesus. He wanted to disappear for a significant period of time to go and do all this, handle these arrangements, I guess. And Jesus was saying, listen, if you want to follow me, then find somebody else to look after those details, because I trump that, basically. And it becomes a much more reasonable response in light of those expanded details, I think. Anyway, that was a free aside. I saw one of these. In fact, some of you may remember it. There was a famous incident tour that went through the Royal Ontario Museum, where they claimed to have an ossuary that had some names on it that related to the eyewitness period. And anyway, long story short, the ossuary was deemed to be a fake after it had done all the tours of the ROM. And I went down to see it because I was so intrigued by it, because I had been interested in this, and it was disappointing to hear it was a fake. But anyway, that's the story of that particular ossuary. Okay. Next one. This is known as the Swoon Theory. Basically, the argument goes like this: Jesus didn't really die. So that's an interesting one, because, if you don't want to deal with the fact that Jesus died and rose again, just make the claim that he actually never even died, at least not then. And the whole argument falls apart, apparently. Well, let's look at a few facts. The first is that Roman executioners were hardened, expert killers. Let's just be honest. These were guys who knew how to kill a man by crucifying them. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. They did it day in and day out. It was a common practice at the time of Jesus. And the guys that did it were pretty unfeeling. In fact, they had to do it correctly, or they faced death themselves. So there was a death penalty if you messed up the crucifixion of an individual and didn't make sure they were dead. We know that one of the soldiers plunged a spear right through Jesus' side to make sure he was dead. We know that there was no need to break his legs. Why is that important? Well, without going into too many gruesome details, the fact is that in crucifixion, the person does not die from having two nails driven through their wrists and a nail plunged through their feet and then elevated above the ground on a cross-like structure. That's not what kills you. What kills you is that you cannot breathe when your arms are stretched out above your head for very long, because you can't breathe in. And so what people did on the cross is they would push up with their feet to take the load off of their arm. Wanted to speed up the demise of an individual who'd been crucified, then you broke their legs so that they could not push up. And that is a very gruesome fact, but it is why the Bible records this story about the soldiers breaking the legs of the men that were crucified with Jesus, but when they came to Jesus, they saw he was no longer alive, and they did not need to break his legs. That's why. And again, the Bible records this very, very specific detail. Counter argument would be, okay, let's assume you're right. Jesus was crucified, but he didn't really die on the cross. But that means that somehow after he was tortured and crucified, he was able to overcome the guards and escape. Not only that, but here's a man now in critical condition, has lost copious amounts of blood and fluids, and he's able to convince his followers that he has just gloriously triumphed over death. I think I'd be skeptical, wouldn't you? So this theory basically says, yeah, Jesus was still alive when they took him down from the cross, but he later revived in the tomb. And then he appeared to the disciples as the risen Lord. Well, I think you see my point. That's highly unlikely. And there's absolutely nothing that we read about Jesus in the scriptures that would indicate he's any kind of a fraud. It's just, he would not do that. It's not who he was. But that's a minor point, but an important one. Okay, getting near the end here, do our sixth one. This is the hallucination theory, and that is that basically Jesus followers were smoking something. So the claims that they make were essentially induced by some kind of a hallucinogenic substance. Well, you know, you'd have to explain how everybody that made these claims were all doing that then. There's numerous resurrection accounts, like I said earlier, by a wide variety of people at all different times and places and under various circumstances, including over 500 people at one time. So this is hard to justify that everybody was smoking something. Furthermore, the disciples, they saw, they heard, they touched, they conversed, they ate with Jesus. These are not hallucinogenic experiences. These are common, everyday experiences that you would expect to have between two human beings. So they're not weird in any way. Furthermore, the disciples, being Jewish, were predisposed not to believe in an individual rising from the dead. Jewish people had a general, still do, have a more general view of resurrection that relates to all of humanity and specifically to the Jewish nation. But the idea that a specific individual would rise from the dead was not a Jewish concept. So they were predisposed not to believe this at all. So, you know, why would they come up with this? Well, because they were smoking something. Well, no, you see, it's just, it doesn't work. And lastly, the twin brother theory. This is a bit of a strange one, but it's been used and argued. Jesus had an identical twin. I think this is a bit of grasping at straws, but basically the argument says that these twins were separated at birth, him as the resurrected Christ. So let's assume that that's true. What would have had to have happened for that twin brother to accomplish this? Well, he would have found, lurk in the shadows, bypass the guards that Jesus had, and then convince over 500 people that he really was Jesus. Really hard to swallow that. How did he appear and disappear in closed rooms if he was just a normal human? And lastly, the vision theory. Jesus was a disembodied vision. Well, again, you know, how do we explain the disciples' very real physical encounter with Jesus after his resurrection? Again, over 500 people claim to have seen Jesus. Could all of these have been seeing some non-corporeal experience with Jesus? That's not what they described. Like I said earlier, they described that which you'd expect between a normal human talking to another human being, now glorified, but still having a typical interaction. Come on over, guys, sit down, have a piece of fish. How was your fishing? That's what you'd expect, right? So how do we explain the resurrection? This idea is dangerous. And that's why Ken Samples in his book, 7 Truths That Changed the World, this is the #1 dangerous idea of Christianity. And it's because Christianity makes a very unique claim. The first and most important one, of course, is that not only did Jesus rise from the dead, and therefore death has been conquered, at least by one person. Namely, the risen Christ resurrected one day. This is a profound claim. It is a radical idea. But how do we explain the resurrection? Well, after 2,000 years, the most reasonable explanatory theory for the events that surrounded Jesus' death and resurrection is quite simple. And that is that the disciples told the truth. Jesus was raised bodily from the dead. That's the best and most reasonable explanation, given the evidence. We could ask questions like, what year is it? It's 2021. Well, 2021 years from what? Oh, oh yeah, that event, that thing that happened 2,000 years ago. We've literally lived all the other proofs that we presented, or arguments, proof arguments that we presented, are pretty extensive. And I must tell you that it's one of the things that was the turning point in my own life. I knew all about the Bible and the Bible stories, and I knew about Jesus and the wonderful things he did, and the feeding the 5,000, and the this, the that, and the next thing. And I even knew about, they crucified him, and they put him in a tomb, and then he rose again from the dead. And now he's off somewhere on vacation. It's when somebody challenged me that Jesus being resurrected means that he's alive now. And you can know him now in this real time. For me, it was 1973. That was the thing. It's my older brother, actually, who placed this in front of me, because he was like me. He also knew all the stories. But the key that I was missing was, it wasn't just believing in a bunch of stories. It was about now being able to encounter the living Christ exactly the same way that Paul did. Maybe not as dramatically, but still it was a very real encounter, and one which I have never looked back on. And so many things fit together for me in my own life. And that's when I gave my life to Jesus and have followed him ever since. I want to finish off with a little bit more about what I said about the resurrection and how it relates to us as followers of Christ. The resurrection is our great hope. Why do I say that? Because historically, the great hope of the Christian church has always been resurrection. I don't mean the resurrection, I mean resurrection. That Jesus was first resurrected, and all believers also will one day be resurrected. You can go and read Romans 8:18-25. Paul speaks about this. Now, it's been in more recent times that there's been a shift in this emphasis away from, I would argue, the historical emphasis that Christians have placed. And that is to this notion of, going to heaven when you die. And we've all heard it, right? There's so many songs, so many sermons I'm sure you've heard. We talk about it all the time when people are facing death. We talk about them going to heaven when they die, as if that is the end. That's it. They died, now they're in heaven, we're done. That has never been, historically anyway, the great hope of the Christian church. It just hasn't. What has been the great hope? Resurrection. Sure, in death, we enter into an unhindered, blissful union with Christ. But, and here's the big but, our final destiny is not heaven. It is the new heavens and the new earth. Revelation 21:1. We have a future that involves the very real resurrection of our bodies, our bodies. We will get a new body. And one of the problems and philosophical influences that rose up in the early church before 100 AD and for the next 200 or 300 years and has continued even to this day is the notion of Gnosticism. And the philosophical worldview of Gnosticism basically teaches that that which is spiritual is good and that which is earthly or physical is evil or corrupt. And the goal is to escape from the physical and achieve the spiritual. This is not a biblical idea. And there are huge chunks of the New Testament that are written specifically by Paul and John and others to combat the early emergence of Gnosticism as a challenge to the claims of the Christian gospel. And that is because the great hope for Christians was that they would be resurrected one day. But if the body is evil, then that can't be a good thing. Well, yes, it can. So the concept of resurrection was a fatal blow to Gnosticism because it taught this spirit good, physical evil concept. And so I just note with Paul when he says in Romans 8:23 that we wait eagerly. This is Paul speaking now. He says, and I'm quoting, we wait eagerly for the redemption of our body. Notice he didn't say we wait eagerly to go to heaven. Now, don't get me wrong. Please don't shoot me. And I'm glad this is recorded so I can be perfectly clear. I am not saying that heaven is not important and we don't go to heaven when we die. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the ultimate goal, God himself has made clear to us, that we will reign with him in a new heaven and new earth. And it's interesting because those of you that have been around Reasons to Believe for any period of time will know that that fits perfectly with what Hugh Ross and all the other scholars at RTB say about the future of the cosmos. Coming back to where I started, and I spoke about the naturalist who is facing a very, very depressing future. For the Christian, for the follower of this risen Christ, we have a hope that this heaven, these cosmos, and this earth, this solar system, though it will perish, will be recreated by the Creator who created this one, and we will reign with him forever and ever. That is the great hope of the Christian church. And it is what RTB speaks about from a science perspective, but it is also theologically what the Bible teaches us in terms of our future as well. The elements will be burned up with a great heat, Peter says, and yet we have this hope. And that's why we don't grieve as those who have no hope when it comes to the issues of death and dying. So that's it. That brings my talk to an end. Thank you very much for listening. And I guess I'm going to let Bruno take over again, and we'll take some questions if you have any. I'm happy to do my best to answer. Thanks, Bruno.
Thank you, Don, for the.
I'm going to stop sharing now. Or have you already killed it?
No, I have not.
Okay. Just a minute here. Sorry. No, I don't think I'm sharing anymore. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes, I am.
Stop sharing. Okay, there you
There
go.
we go. Thank you, Don, for reminding us of the hope that we have for a new heaven and a new earth. I'd like to, yeah, now let's have some, anyone that has any questions could just go ahead and ask Don, or maybe it's, or anyone else.
Don, I have a question. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, hear you fine.
Okay. When Jesus was
Go ahead, Chris.
resurrected, would he look exactly the same as that forever? He's not changing, I assume. That's the way he's going to look?
That is a great question. The first thing that I would say is clearly this new body he had some remarkable properties. He could appear and disappear at will in rooms where the doors were closed. But more importantly, the disciples knew who it was immediately. It wasn't like, oh, who's that guy? They knew it was Jesus. So he looked like him. He looked like himself to the disciples. Now, I imagine that there were certain differences. I imagine that he didn't have all the effects of having been just brought down from a cross, for example, the blood and the sweat and everything all over him. He probably looked a little different in that sense, but he looked like Jesus. I remember reading one writer who said that one of the remarkable things about Jesus is that when he became a man, at his assumed human form, he became a man forever. And that he reigns at the right hand of the Father and has this physical form. It's a new physical form. Whether it is different, I don't know. It's really a great question, but there's no way for us to know whether it will be the same for all of us, whether it will be the same as what the disciples saw. I have no reason to believe it would be different, but we have no way to know because we can't go there and come back and say, okay, well, I saw Jesus and da-da-da, although we might touch on that a little bit later tonight, depending on the questions. But good question, Chris. Good one.
Well, I have another quick question, if I may.
Go ahead.
And that is, people that have seen angels, like we had a fellow at our church that saw this, basically an angel. It appears with these angels that they can appear as people, and then the next thing you know, they vanished. So they have bodies, and they're perfectly normal bodies, and yet I think they have the ability to just sort of vanish. Do you think there's any similarity between this type of body and that we've heard about in with angels?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've read lots about angelic, visitations and encounters and so on, and I've, no reason to doubt them. All of them. Some of them are very credible, and yeah, I've seen the same sort of details around it. Is that they are very normal. You wouldn't know it, and the scriptures themselves speak to us about this. I forget exactly where it's written, but it says that some have entertained angels without knowing it.
Well,
Abraham
entertained 3 angels. I mean, who knows?
Yep.
Where,
I'm talking about the New Testament.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is post resurrection. Some have entertained angels without knowing it. It says so.
Yeah.
Whether that was post resurrection, who knows? They could be referring to an earlier time. But the point is that clearly it's possible to have an angelic being in your presence and you don't even know it. So is that in some way related to Jesus' resurrected body? I think so. I mean, that makes sense to me. The properties that he seemed to exhibit or his body exhibited, and those that we read about in terms of some of these angels that have appeared in the Bible, and those reports of people who claim to have had similar types of angelic encounters all seem to have a similar pattern. So, you know, yeah, I can go along with that. I think the key here, and this is probably the most important thing I could say about this, is that the Bible is very clear when it comes to any kind of supernatural experience. The Bible gives us clear parameters that we must judge those experiences through, a matrix, if you like, that allows us to accurately discern whether this experience is of God or not of God.
Sure,
Because the same scriptures tell us that even the devil can appear as an angel of light. So somebody says, well, I saw an angel and he was very bright and so on and so on. That doesn't mean he was an angel. The Bible even tells us that. It warns us of that. But does that mean that every person who has seen an angel or had an experience with an angel, it therefore was the devil? No, that does not follow. The scriptures teach us that we must discern carefully, and it must fit the rest of the scriptures. So does your experience glorify God? Does it fit with what we understand about the character of God and what he's revealed about us in the scriptures? So as long as it fits and makes sense within the broader paradigms and teaching and instruction of the scriptures, then yes, we can have a reasonable reason to say that that experience was legitimate and possibly even sent from God. But we don't live our lives or base our lives on the basis of those experiences because they are subjective by nature. They're your experience that doesn't necessarily have the same authority or should not have the same authority as the scriptures, which have historical authority as well as forensic authority. I hope that.
Well, that's perfect. Yes.
Helps.
Good.
Chris, getting back to your question about the appearance of Jesus, there is in Revelation, I think chapter 1, where John saw Jesus, and the way he describes him, it's not like his the way he looked when he was first resurrected. So there was some change there during that time. John wrote that about the year 90. So like from 33 to 90, Jesus somehow changed slightly in his appearance, or maybe a major change. We don't know exactly.
Well, I think Jesus wants to have a body like we will have, so that he wants to be really close to us, so that we can, commune with him, type thing. He has a similar body. I mean, he's basically God. He's just taking on a body like us, so that he can relate to us as brothers, I guess.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, are you referring, Bruno, to some of the visionary aspects that John related, where he saw Jesus with, the sword coming out of his mouth and, the stars in his hand? Or is that what you're referring to?
Well, I don't know if he actually saw Jesus or if it was just a vision.
Well, yeah. So that's where I was going to go with that, is that clearly in Revelations, there are many visionary aspects, which John himself tells us that it was not. He was not claiming that these were real. He was claiming that he saw this in a vision, and he relates that vision. What the church had to deal with canonically was, okay, this was not a physical experience John had. It was a vision that he claims he observed. And so what should we do with this? So what I like about it is the fact that the Bible doesn't make any bones about the fact that it was a vision. John doesn't try and put it off as, hey, this happened to me while I was on Patmos. I was, on the island of Patmos. I was walking along, and all of a sudden this guy came up to me with a sword coming out of his mouth. That's not what John did. He said, I had a vision. Now, you can say, well, okay, what were you smoking, John? Or you could say, John was an apostle. He's a legitimate guy. He wrote portions of the New Testament. Maybe we should take whatever he's saying seriously. And that's what they did. But that vision contains all kinds of images which are just that. They're images from a vision. So I would not say that Jesus changed when we read between, what the disciples saw after the resurrection and what we read about in Revelations. I don't see that as a correlation.
Okay, yeah. I forgot there was a vision even at the beginning.
Yeah. Somebody asked a question in the chat. Maybe I'll just try and answer that one. So somebody said, "We will reign with him. Who are the subjects under our reign?" That's a great question. I don't think it's a question of reigning in the sense of there will be subjects that we will reign in. I think it's more to do with the original grand vision that God gave humanity when he created us and the first creation. Remember what he said. He told us to reign over his creation, over the fish of the sea, and he went through the list. And I believe that God's original intent was that humanity would care for the earth the way he wanted us to. And we all know what happened and what is continuing to happen. And I would say that one of the strongest ecological arguments you can make as a believer is to go back to Genesis and ask the question, well, what was God's original intent? And his original intent is that we would not rape the earth and abuse the earth, but that we would care for it, not worship it. Very clear about that. We worship the creator, not the creation. A lot of, ecological ideologues today have no interest in the creator, but they want to worship the creation. So they've got it backwards. But the proper Christian response, I believe, is to have a good biblical understanding of how we were to care for the earth. So that's baseline. The fast forward now to the new heavens and the new earth, I believe it will be exactly the same thing, except now there will be no sin, there will be no fall. We will do that which God intended for us to do anyway, and now in a new heaven and a new earth. So what we're going to reign over, what we're going to be responsible for, I have no idea. All I know is it's going to be incredibly exciting, and it's going to be phenomenal. We are not going to be sitting around, walking on streets of gold, strumming harps. I can assure you, we're just not. It makes no sense. We have work to do in the new heaven and the new earth, I believe. Work that is not work as in, but work as in something that is glorifying to God and will continue to bring him glory forever. And so it's not a reigning over of people or of individuals, it's a reigning over his new creation. I think that's, and I'm not alone in that, but we could all be wrong. I don't know.
And we
So I
may
hope that
have say or the voice in a divine council where there will be counseling about what the next thing to do will be and how we're going to create and what.
Yep.
But
there is a.
I was
going to say, Jan, there's also a reference to judging angels in the scriptures.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I don't know what that's about. I don't know about you guys, but I don't feel qualified to judge angels. But maybe in the new heaven and new earth, we will be qualified. Clearly, we will be. There will be something to do with judging angels. Who knows what that's about? If that happens, I'm going to turn to Jesus and say, listen, I wasn't without sin, so I'm not throwing the first stone. Find somebody else. I'm just kidding. Anyway, you were going to say, Jan.
I wanted to share a story that may have some importance in the resurrection, for the resurrection case, obviously. And this is the story of Lazarus. As we know, he was basically the man who had two tombs. So he was kind of better than Jesus in that sense. But but if you go to Jerusalem on the other side in Bethany, on the other side of the Mount of Olives, there is still the house of Lazarus and his sisters, and also there is a tomb that you can visit, right? Which obviously he is not there. Yeah, I've been there too, so it's kind of exciting for me too, right? But the interesting thing was, when you look at the Passion story, the welcoming of the Jews, of the people in Jerusalem, was connected directly to this culmination point in Jesus' ministry, where basically his miracles were escalating to the point where he actually would resurrect Lazarus, right? And then when he entered Jerusalem, people were excited and happy, and we're saying that this is our new king. Obviously, that was the black eye for the Jewish authorities at that point of time, because they wanted to make sure they got the power and nobody is taking it away from them, right? So everything just comes together very well, and then apparently he wasn't mentioned in the other Gospels except for John's, and some people explain it in such a way that Lazarus was actually warned that, and people didn't want to talk too much about Lazarus because he was the guy that people would come to him and say, well, what do you think about this resurrection of Jesus? And he would say, well, what do I think? I mean, he resurrected me, so what do you think I think, right? So he was a danger, and he was, in fact, he was a fugitive to the point where apparently he had to flee Jerusalem in order to save his life.
Yes, because they wanted to kill him.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as it appears, he settled in Cyprus, and he basically preached the gospel in Cyprus, in the town of southern Cyprus, which I forgot the name. It was Laramia, if I recall it correct. So apparently in the 70s, there was a church of Lazarus in this town, and in the 70s, or actually it's the Church of Saint Lazarus. The church was burned out, and they dug out the foundations, and they found the tomb that apparently belonged to Saint Lazarus, and so this is where his second tomb is, and you can still visit his both tombs if you want to, right? So since my barber is from Cyprus, this is going to be my next talk to him when I meet him.
Yeah, well, that's true. Everything you said is correct, Jan. I would just mention one thing, and that is that keep in mind that when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus did not have a new body.
True.
He had the same body,
Absolutely.
which still decayed and suffered death at some point. You're quite right. So he died twice, essentially. So when we talk about resurrection, we have to make a very clear distinction here between those that Jesus resurrected, and there were others, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Scriptures tell us that he raised lots of people from the dead. So it's not that Jesus was the first to rise from the dead. It was that Jesus was the first to rise from the dead forever with a new body.
With a new body.
That's the key. He did not die again. So that's a very important distinction, and at the very heart of the resurrection. When we speak about that, when we use that word, that's what we mean. But yeah, I mean, there's people that have risen from the dead through Jesus' ministry, both while he was on the earth and since then. Lots of recorded people being raised from the dead. The apostles did it. Yeah, I think Alan has his hand up.
You're
You're on
muted.
mute.
Alan.
You're on mute,
Alan is
Alan.
muted.
Take yourself off mute
Oh, I'm
there,
sorry.
Alan.
I'm asking about, sorry, I'm asking about Peony's question about other, Gilgamesh and other pagan
Sure.
that are the same as the biblical accounts. And a lot of people will question me and they say, well, how do you know the Bible didn't just imitate them and all the rest
Right.
of it? What would you say to that?
So great question. Thank you for asking it.
That's actually Peony's question, but
I see that. I'm looking at that right now. So yeah, I mean, the notion is that the resurrection story was stolen from Sumerian myths and based on sun worship. And even the idea of a virgin birth predates the Bible, perhaps an Egyptian religious thing, not sure. So the idea is that it's claimed that the Bible borrowed these ideas from previous pagan legends. Well,
yeah. even the flood, Gilgamesh,
Yeah. So again, I kind of did touch on this earlier when I spoke about the idea of nugget logic. The idea that, oh, look at that. There's a similarity between the Christian story and the pagan myth. Oh, well, in that case, then all of Christianity and all of its claims must be a myth. Well, that doesn't follow. I mean, just because something is similar does not mean it was based on it at all. But more importantly, I would say, okay, let's assume you're right. Do those Sumerian myths have the evidence that Christianity can put forward? You call it a myth, but we've just spent over an hour talking about how the claims of just the resurrection, never mind the authenticity of the scriptures as a whole, we've talked about how there's evidence, and not just biblical evidence, but non-extra biblical or evidence outside of the Bible for many of the things that Christianity claims. So the writings of the scriptures themselves are not mythological in style. Like I hopefully made the case earlier, many of the portions of the scriptures are forensic in style. The kind of writing that you'd expect from a criminal investigator. So these are not mythological writings. So any similarities there may be, to me, are actually begging the question, which one is the myth? Just because it predates it does not necessarily mean that therefore they borrowed from it. It just doesn't follow.
Now the other argument could be that if there is extra biblical accounts of the flood, well, doesn't that mean that actually it happened? It just happened to be conveyed in different ways in different cultures, right? And some cultures, for some cultures, the transmission means is the myth, right, or legend. And for some others, it's cuneiform tablets, and for the other ones, it's it's Greek or Hebrew, right?
Yep. The other thing too, just to add to what Jan said is, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, Alan, that. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that the biblical text, extra biblical texts like Enoch and all those, they were very, very old scriptures, and these passed around, and so those pagans could have taken that up and made up their own mythology according to those ancient texts when they were prophecies that didn't happen yet. Like, I don't know if you guys have read the book of Enoch, but it gave me a lot of insight into the book of Revelation, and I've read it twice, and what kills, the rabbis didn't like the book because it was too messianic in its writings, right? It talked about the Messiah, and so the rabbis didn't quite like it. And anyway, there was a lot of, that's why it was not canonical book, but it was apparently the first book ever written in literature. Like he invented writing, and he had all these prophecies about Christ, the resurrection, and all that in it. And if that went around the world, of course the pagans would look at that and have their own mythology based on that kind of extra biblical literature. And like Peter talked about Enoch, and like he's referred a couple of times. So anyways, I don't know if you've ever read it, but that's a apocrypha book that to me is very interesting. Anyway, that's all I can say, is that they didn't, the Bible doesn't post, it actually was written by a biblical character, right? Like Enoch or those others. And Job, like that's a very old book.
Yeah. So when it comes to the apocryphal books, I'm not an expert. I've read F.F. Bruce's books on the canon of Scripture, and how how the church made these decisions around the canonical books. I just know that, as you pointed out, Alan, it is an apocryphal book. It was not included and is not included in the canon, at least amongst Protestants. But
yeah, well, Enoch,
it doesn't mean it's worthless. It just means that it's not canonical.
I think it's worthwhile reading, because I guess the reason why it wasn't a canon, there were four chapters which are controversial, and the rabbis actually edited those 4 chapters because they didn't like the messianic message, and it went counterintuitive to what they were thinking, and so error on the side of caution. What do you call it? The church decided, well, we won't have it as canon, but it's apocrypha, and it's good for historical and inspirational benefit, right? And
well, it's the same as the Book of Maccabees, right? We do derive some historical events from the Book of Maccabees, but it's not. It's not canon.
I would like you, Ross, to read it sometime, because it talks a lot about astronomy and how God constructed the heavens. It's amazing, and he had a number system to it. It's beyond me, but I often wonder, geez, Hugh Ross should read that book and interpret it for us. But anyway,
I'm sure he has. But I want to come back to the comment about the flood. So keep in mind that there's something that people maybe are not aware of when they bring this up, is that there are many flood accounts, and one of the reasons why there are many flood accounts is because there have been many floods. So the flood that occurred, that is recorded in the scriptures, was not the only time there had ever been a flood in the Mesopotamian Valley. There had been other floods before and after. So there are parts of the world where it is reasonable to understand that flood accounts emerged because they happened. The difference between those flood accounts and the flood account recorded in the scriptures in Genesis is that particular flood is from God's hand and had a very specific purpose. And he tells us what that purpose was. So I'm not at all perturbed by the fact that there are other flood accounts circulating around and were circulating around before the flood was recorded in Genesis. That to me is like, well, so, what are you proving?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Somebody asked a question here. Can I just explain again the meaning of forensic in style? So we all know what a forensic investigator is. A person who's a forensic investigator is someone who comes upon a scene, and this is quite frankly an area where Jeff Francis is, who's with us tonight, is an expert, beyond an expert, someone was called upon in his career to explain this. And I'm going to ask Jeff to jump in a moment, but basically a person doing a forensic analysis is looking at evidence and figuring out what happened before the thing they're looking at happened. In other words, they came upon a scene, whatever it would be, a dead body, a bridge that's just fallen down or whatever. And the forensic person is doing the forensic analysis has to figure out, well, how did this happen? So Jeff, maybe you want to just jump in here if you would, or if you can,
Okay, well,
and maybe just build this idea of forensic, and then I'll take it back to the scriptures in a moment.
yeah, I was a civil forensic in the civil legal world, not the criminal world. I want to make that clear. And very, very briefly, usually when you arrive on the site of where the civil complaint came from, everybody tells you what their ideas are, and of course, they're usually wrong. In fact, they're almost always wrong. So your first idea is wrong. And when you look at some of the scriptures of, well, who was it you were saying?
Book of Acts.
Book of Acts, yeah, John, Luke.
Luke wrote, yeah.
Yes, I am not going to take issue with you at all. That's all I'll say, Don.
So I remember Jeff telling me about a building somewhere, I think it was in Toronto, where the glass fell off the building. Is that right, Jeff?
Oh,
you were involved in that?
many times, yes.
Yeah. So the glass fell off, and of course, hit the ground and everything. So when Jeff arrives on the scene, what does he see? He sees glass on the ground, and he sees empty panes up there. And now he's got to figure out, well, how did this happen, right? And the role of a forensic engineer is to figure out what is it about that structure that failed, that gave rise to what we observe, which is broken glass on the floor or on the ground.
So in one of those cases, Don, not myself, but a colleague did find a impurity in the glass about a quarter the size of a pinhead, or
Wow.
less than that. Yeah,
That's amazing.
That took some doing.
So the point is not just to figure out what happened, but to prevent it, right? In those situations. But
As always.
so the easiest way to answer this question is to read to you from Acts chapter 1. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the first few verses, but listen to so when I say style, listen to the style of this writing. Okay. So this is Luke writing, and he says, the first account I composed, Theophilus, writing to his friend Theophilus, about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up, that means resurrected, after he had by the Holy Spirit given orders to the apostles whom he had chosen. To these, that is to those apostles, he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many convincing proofs, appearing to them over a period of 40 days and speaking of the things concerning the kingdom of God. And gathering them together, he commanded them not to leave Jerusalem, but to wait for what the Father had promised, which he said, you heard of from me. So he goes on, talks about the Holy Spirit and so forth and so on. If you listen to that style, what can we observe? Well, we can observe a number of things. First of all, it's very coherent. It's stepwise. He's building a case. Secondly, he brings in critical details to corroborate his argument. He gets the order correct. He gets the individuals involved correct. He talks about the evidence for what he's saying, and he claims that he investigated all this so that he would understand clearly why he was writing this. That is a forensic style. It would be the same as Jeff being hired to go and do an investigation and saying, okay, guys, here's my report. This is what I observed. This is how I tested it. These are the people I talked to, and here's my conclusion. That's exactly what Luke did. Okay, so that's what we mean by a forensic style. As opposed to the Psalms, for example. The Psalms is not a forensic style. The Psalms is more poetry. It's a different style of writing. One is not better than the other, but when it comes to apologetics and providing a an argument for why we have the faith we have, then the forensic style is extremely important. And I'm just thankful for guys like Luke that wrote the way they did. So I hope that helps.
Don, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Bruno.
Many people have had near-death experiences, and they say that because of that, they're not afraid of dying because they're convinced that heaven is real. And some of them say they saw Jesus, and the others didn't see anyone. And some people will come away from these stories and think that everyone's going to go to heaven. So how would you respond to such a conclusion?
That's a great question. So I think the first thing I would say is that there is a tremendous amount of evidence that near-death experiences are legitimate. In other words, the people who claim to have had them really had them. So it's not like everybody's just, having a hallucination. There's just way too much, too many interesting facts around some of these near-death experiences that give us reason to pause and go, okay, that person had some kind of authentic experience. Okay, so we don't dismiss them. One of the things I have read, and I know that RTB has some resources actually on this topic that we can refer you to. About 20%, I think, of the cataloged or reported near-death experiences that people have reported have been not pleasant, have not been, wonderful, warm light encircling me. They've been quite terrifying, in fact, quite the opposite of what the person would have wanted to experience. So it's not just that they're good or that some of them are bad. It's just that we're just saying as a fact that there is this spectrum of experiences. So that's the first thing I would just observe. The second thing is that, sort of jumping to the end of your question, is because of near-death experiences, therefore everybody is going to experience a relationship with God when they die. I don't see that follows, because people have had experiences, as you say, where they saw Jesus somewhere they didn't. The experience itself doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. It's just an experience, or whatever they claim from that experience is necessarily true. There are probably many more people who are not followers of Christ who've had experiences, near-death experiences. And if you try and use that as an argument for why the Bible is true, I think you're going to lose that argument, because many, many more people who don't follow the Christian faith have had a near-death experience and would claim that they too, saw Buddha or saw, whoever, right? So just the experience alone does not corroborate the worldview. If it doesn't, then what does? And what does is the evidence for that worldview. So I think that at the end of the day, whilst we don't say they're completely irrelevant and not important at all, it cannot be the basis for our faith in the risen Christ is an experience, because those experiences are quite different. And secondly, and more importantly, there is a huge body of evidence for the Christian faith that doesn't require a supernatural experience, including a near-death experience, to corroborate those claims. We don't need to have that. The most important supernatural experience that anyone has ever had was the Lord Jesus himself, and that was the topic of tonight, his resurrection. And The scriptures is what provides us the evidence for why we can put our faith in that resurrection. It is not based on the fact that somebody nearly died and saw Jesus, and therefore the entire Bible was born. That's not how it happened. So I guess what I'm saying is that the evidence that we can put our faith in is overwhelmingly more important than any near-death experience a person could have. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
There's 3 hands up now, but Alan, I think you didn't take yours down earlier. I see.
Well, yeah, quickly, I wanted to corroborate your powerful message of forensic evidence. I was watching a movie with Paul Newman, Academy Award-winning movie, and he was losing his case. And he says, because they were hiding the evidence, the opposition. And so he says, if I can just find one credible evidence, then I can overturn and win my case. I've got to find one credible evidence, and I have to do it forensically. And you can see the movie for itself. And he brought in faith and the whole 9 yards. And I thought to myself, if he's going to win the case, which he did, with one credible evidence, we have over 500 credible evidence of his resurrection, and it was forensically presented by Luke and others. So I was thinking of that when I saw the movie. I says, wow, man, Christ has 500 evidences, and this guy is going to win the case on one good, credible evidence. And that's how our legal system is based. If you can get a good, credible evidence, you can often win the case on just one piece of credible evidence.
Yeah,
that's my final point today.
Well, I think that one of the things I didn't say, which I should say, is that the evidence for the resurrection is one of the most corroborated historical events in all of history. And many scholars who are not Christians and who are not followers of Christ would agree with that statement.
Yeah.
They just disagree with the conclusion that, Jesus rising from the dead means something, which is really hard to believe, but, faith is still faith. And, you can't, not everybody is going to look at the evidence and reach the same conclusion. Marina, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Hi, Don.
Hi.
Nice to be with you guys all today. Yes, that was a great presentation, Don. I really appreciate it. This is one of my favorite topics, and it's just great when we get a chance to learn more about it, especially during this season of resurrection season that we're in. Yes, I wanted to ask you, Don, just to talk a little bit more about the extra biblical texts, and just I know that you mentioned earlier how
I think we've lost you, Marina, but I got most of it. I think.
I apologize. Yes, I'm back.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
There's a number of extra biblical writers who talk about the events in the scriptures that are not in the in the scriptures, and I'm just pulling up a few of those. I actually do a whole talk on this. It's called "Can We Trust the Bible?" And I'll just list them for you. There's a number of them. One is Suetonius. He wrote the life of Nero and the life of Claudius around 120 AD. Cornelius Tacitus, who was born in 52 AD, he wrote the history of Rome under the emperors, known as the Roman Annals, in 117 AD. And then most famously, Josephus, who was born in 37 AD, he was a Jewish historian. Suetonius mentions Jesus and the persecution of Christians under Nero. Tacitus, who was a contemporary of Suetonius, also mentions the persecution of Christians under Nero. He mentions an individual known as Christus, the Christ, and his death by Pilate's decree. Josephus was a Pharisee, a commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee in 66 AD. He served the Emperor Vespasian, and he wrote extensive histories of the Jewish nation. He writes about Jesus, James, his brother, John the Baptist, Pilate, and many other biblical accounts. So that's just a short list. There are others, early church fathers, for example, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias. These are all early church fathers, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus. These are not biblical writers, but they were early church fathers who wrote huge volumes of works and talked about some of the evidence, not just based on the scriptures themselves. So, yeah. So tonight wasn't designed to kind of have that list of evidence, but since you brought it up, I was able to quickly find it there. And maybe some other time we can do that talk, but it's not specific to the resurrection per se, which is why I didn't include it in this talk, but it is corroborative toward the many of the events in the scriptures in the New Testament. So that's why they're important.
I could add that Josephus' testimony is extremely important because he was also trained Jewish priest, a Pharisee, right? And so
That's
his
right.
insight and understanding and knowledge of Jerusalem and the temple was extensive. So his testimony is important in that respect. There is a new book by the lady Eugenia Constantinou, The Crucifixion of the King of the Glory, the Amazing History and Sublime Mystery of the Passion. And she happens to have, she's a biblical scholar, and she happens to have the law background as well. She's married to a Greek Orthodox priest from San Diego, apparently. And so I've heard about the book and learned, from the Eric Metaxas show a lot about what she had to offer. So I thought I would just plug in for those who are interested, because her background is also kind of, from the point of view of attorney and law and as well biblical scholar and also the Jewish scholar. She's very well she understands very well the rabbinic literature from the 2nd century, and so she puts all of this information together. One thing that I've learned from her, and I don't know how she got there, that apparently the event with Abraham and Isaac, being bound by Abraham in order to sacrifice him, took place according to the rabbinic tradition from the 2nd century, or before Christ, took place on the 14th of Nisan, which is basically the date of crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ, right? So there's a number of things.
The Jewish month of Nisan, you mean?
Yeah, extremely interesting from a different angle that I haven't heard about up until now. So,
well, I want to just hasten to say there are many authors and scholars out there who have covered this topic far better than I can. I am not an expert on this. I've drawn on a number of resources for this talk, but there are many scholars who have gone far deeper on this topic, and those are available with a little bit of searching on the internet. You can find them. This is such an important topic, and it really is, the Easter story, and it's a story that we need to tell. And we need to remind people that it's Easter for a reason. And for me personally, Easter is the most important part of the annual celebrations that we can give ourselves to. To me, it's far more important than Christmas. Yes, it's wonderful that Jesus was born and the manger story and all that is wonderful, but it just pales into insignificance compared to the resurrection, because all of history is dependent on the resurrection, and all of the future and our lives are dependent on the resurrection. As Paul said, if Christ is not raised from the dead, then we are of all men most to be pitied. And but if it's true, then it's true for everyone. And so I encourage you, tell the story to your friends and family and colleagues, and in a gentle and winsome way, remind them of the story of Easter and why it's so important and why it's rooted in history. It's not just a story.
Sheg, do you have a final question from Sheg?
Yeah, I thought he asked his question and he just left his hand up. I don't know if he still wants
Okay.
another question, or Sheg, speak now, or okay.
Thank
Can anybody hear?
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
hear you.
Can you? Okay, I want to comment about near-death experience. The latest research I heard was that when a person dies or registered dead, his brain cells are not all dead instantly. They were still alive, but dying slowly, individually, one by one, slowly. And in that time, in that process of dying, the person's having an experience within his brain. And that experience is constructed based on what he knows and what he believes. So his beliefs has a lot to do with what he's experiencing during that time in the near-death experience. So it may not have external reality to it.
Yeah,
And this would explain why a Hindu, when he experienced a near-death experience, he's having the Hindu construct described, in their presentation of what happened to them.
yeah, I think that's all
That's it.
reasonable, Sheg. I think that's reasonable, and I think it does explain a number of near-death experiences. And I really don't want to, spend a lot of time on this, but it does. Unfortunately, it doesn't explain all of them. There are some very interesting experiences that have been well documented where someone has died, and you often hear of how they find themselves above the situation, whatever it is, whether it's an operating room or something, but they find themselves literally above the scene, looking down on their body. And in the one experience that I read about, it was actually Gary Habermas, who you've probably all heard of. He's known as the Bible Answer Man. He's a great scholar, and is currently working on an amazing sort of summary of just about everything he's ever done. It's going to be called his magnum opus, but he related a story that I heard about near-death experience where this woman dies and she can see down on the scene, and on the top of one of the machines, it was in the operating room, there was a serial number written on the top of the machine. And she says, I'm an OCD person, obsessive compulsive kind of person, and I have an eye for detail. So I memorized this number while I was floating above my body. And so anyway, she was recovering later and told the nurse about it. And the nurse just, almost mindlessly wrote this down and then put it away somewhere in her file. And what happens is, the story goes, they move this equipment later, and we're going to get rid of it or something. And this nurse goes, well, wait a minute, before you do that, can you just look on top of this? And her memory remembered you know, what this lady says. So she went up and checked it, and sure enough, there was the serial number was identical to what she had written down. So, you know, this is not a religious experience. This is just an experience, right? But I only relate that story just to say that there's a wide variety of these experiences, and I think that's why we have to be careful that we don't draw, you know, huge conclusions from them. And you're quite right, by the way, about the brain cells not dying immediately. It takes a little while for that to happen. But yeah, maybe we can end on a small joke. But how did the joke go? Something about when you die, you know, your fingernails continue to grow, but phone calls tend to taper off. So I thought that was funny. Anyway, thank you all. You've been a great audience, and it's lovely to see you all. And we are hopeful of getting back together again in person, as Bruno mentioned. And I certainly look forward to that myself.
See you all next month, I hope. And you know, just check your email for announcements. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Okay.
you very much. We'll see you next month.
Thank you so
Bye,
much
everyone.
again. Thank
You're welcome.
you, Don.
Bye-bye.